The three gifts that the Magi give to Jesus and his family this evening are richly symbolic, right? We've all heard them many, many times: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And they carry a lot of meaning with them. That gold, of course, is a very valuable substance. It was fit for a king. And gold also was used in the temple, most especially for the Ark of the Covenant, right? The place of God's dwelling in the heart of the temple. So there's a very priestly, kind of holy sense to gold. Myrrh was a very common substance of the time that had many, many uses. Myrrh was used in burial mixtures. So Jesus, when he was buried in the tomb, would have been buried with a whole mixture of herbs and different spices, and among those would have been myrrh. And the Mosaic law also says that the oil used to anoint the Jewish priests would have myrrh mixed in. So there's something about death with myrrh, something about priesthood with myrrh. So there's all these allusions going on. And frankincense is the one that we're probably most aware of without being aware of it, because frankincense is just incense, and we use incense at Mass, of course, when the priest, takes out these little pebble rocks, and he puts them on a hot charcoal, and the smoke defies all the laws of physics, right, and travels at the speed of light. And as soon as Father puts the incense on, somebody the back row starts coughing. You're like, wow, it's incredible. I'm on to you guys back there. So I was kind of recently made aware of some really interesting facts about frankincense by this monk from Pennsylvania. So this is not my own stuff, but Father Boniface Ramsey is a great monk, and he was explaining that frankincense is not a rock at all, but that frankincense is the blood of a tree, right? So already there's some interesting allusions going on to the cross. Frankincense is the blood of the tree. So what frankincense is it's this resin that comes from the Horn of Africa, and there's a species of very, very dry, kind of tough tree that the locals there will take a mallet and a sharp instrument, and they'll score it. So they'll kind of stab at the tree, and they'll break through the hard outer bark until the sap of the tree starts to run out. So they'll stab the tree all over until the tree's bleeding, and then they'll leave it. And then the sap hardens on the tree, and they'll come back the following day, and they'll chip off that sap. And it's hardened into this kind of thin, kind of light, clear rock. And what they'll do is they'll do that over and over and over again, sometimes 7 times. They'll scour the exact same place on the tree. And as they do that, the resin, that sap, gets thicker and more yellow and more rich as all the nutrients in the sap are seeping out of the tree. And the more that they make the tree suffer, the richer the frankincense becomes. And they'll stab it, and then they'll wait for it to dry, and they'll peel it off, and they'll do it over and over and over again. And the richest stuff that they get at the very end, they grind into pellets, and that's incense. And then at Mass, right, the priest takes the incense and he puts it on the hot coal, and it rises up into the smoke that goes up before God. And this priest, Father Boniface, was explaining that he sees it as a really beautiful image of suffering, right? That the way as Christians that we are transformed by suffering is that so often, right, we suffer in all the same places, right, over and over and over again. Some variety might be a little bit welcome in suffering at points, right? And it has to break through this outer bark, and the suffering over time turns hard, right? It hardens into something really kind of bitter. And then what happens at Mass, what happens at prayer, is that the priest, or we, take our sufferings and we place it on the fire of God's love, right? We place it upon the charcoal of divine charity, and the love melts it, right? And it becomes this really sweet kind of fragrance, and it goes up to God as this prayer. That prayer makes of my wounds worship. I just thought that was tremendously beautiful and very thought-provoking. Of wow, I never really knew that about frankincense. And what I found as a priest so often, and what's helped me so much, is to realize that in my own sufferings, right, I am not alone. That walking with people in their own sufferings and their sins and confession and counseling, I realize that the sadnesses that I have, the fears I have, the sufferings, the anxieties, I'm not alone, right? We all have them. And so there's something very therapeutic for me, serving as a priest and becoming healed and becoming loved in my own sufferings, right? And in serving as a priest, I experience that my own sufferings, my own wounds become worship, right? By being drawn into love. And I experience that that's such a fruitful way to do like priestly ministry is to be with people in their sufferings, in their sadness, in their fears, and just to let them know, right? To tell them, to let them feel that they're not alone, right? And that they're never left alone by God. And that as a priest, just to love them, right? And to allow the heat of that love to turn their wounds, to turn their sufferings into something really beautiful, something very sweet. This evening, we celebrate the Epiphany, right? The showing forth of who God is. And God this evening shows himself forth as someone who suffers. And as Christians, I don't think we brag about that enough, right? We should be like running into the playground and be like, guys, our God suffers. Like, you don't even know, right? Because it's a tremendous revelation to the world. Because suffering is not something that belongs to God. Suffering is a consequence, right, of our fallenness, of our sin, of the brokenness of this world. Suffering is not God. It is the opposite of God. God doesn't make suffering. He doesn't choose suffering. God is not capable of suffering himself. And the tremendously mysterious thing that we celebrate this evening is that God takes on that which is not God. That God reveals himself, right, especially today, but on the cross, as someone who suffers. And this is tremendously transformational for us as Christians, right? Because it tells us that when we suffer, we are never alone. And as Christians, especially as Catholics, when we hear in our sufferings, we'll just offer it up, right? And we hate that saying. That doesn't mean that God is this like Mayan God who like feasts upon the human sacrifice of mortals, right? God doesn't need our suffering. God doesn't want our suffering, right? And it doesn't mean that suffering in itself is somehow good, that if I can somehow suffer more, like God will love me more. Like, absolutely not, right? Suffering is an evil. Suffering is empty. Suffering is nothingness itself. Suffering is not God. Suffering is not good. And when I confront suffering on my own, it's just absolute emptiness, and it's awful, and it's darkness, and it's miserable, right? We're all human, right? And what's tremendously shocking about the Epiphany is that our Lord tells us, and he shows us, that in our suffering, he is with us. What that means is that I can therefore make of my suffering an offering to God, because what I have in my sins, what I have in my suffering, is something that God doesn't. Right? It's one of the few things in my entire life that I can actually give to God that he doesn't already have. He has all perfection. He has all goodness. He is eternity. He is infinite. But he doesn't have suffering. He doesn't have my suffering. And why our Lord loves when we offer him his suffering is not the suffering. That's awful, right? That's a terrible thing. But it's because it's one of the few things that is truly and properly mine. And it's one of the few things that I truly want to cling to, right? And to hide from him and to hide from others. And it's one of the few places in my life, right? Where I want to stand in the dark and point at him and say, my God, why have you forsaken me, right? And it's that in my freedom and in my faith and in my love, I can offer to him. And it becomes a true gift. And he receives it like as a father, right, who receives this really like terrible drawing by his child. Like it's like, is this a horse? Is it a person, right? Like, but he loves it. It's incredibly dear to him, not because of the drawing, but because of the gift itself, that it's properly that child's, and they're in love giving it to him, right? Suffering is so valuable to us as Christians, and it rises up to God, right, in sweetness when it's united with love, because it's ours. And we can freely, truly, lovingly give it to him. And this evening we celebrate, right, an epiphany, a showing forth of a God who out of love himself takes on suffering, right? Freely, willingly becomes a man to die. Fulton Sheen says famously, in the wood of the crib is hidden the wood of the cross, right? That our Lord this evening unveils a tremendous act of love for us, that he too takes upon himself freely that which is not God, and out of love offers it to us. And we as Christians have the opportunity, out of love, to take what is properly ours, our sin and our suffering, our brokenness and our sadness, and to give it to him. And that in that we can find meaning, in that we can find epiphany, purpose, and love.